Order. I've received messages from the Senate returning the following bills without amendment or requests: the Appropriation Bill number 3, 2010-2011 without requests, and the Appropriation Bill number 4, 2010-2011. Order. I've received the following message from the Senate. The Senate returns to the House of Representatives the bill for an act relating to certain companies associated with the National Broadband Network and for other purposes, and informs the House that the Senate has agreed to the bill with the amendments in the annex schedule. The Senate requests the concurrence of the House in the amendments. Now, my script says, I understand it's the wish of the House to consider the bills. The Leader of the House on my script gets the call. Leader of the House.
I move that the amendments be considered immediately.
Well, the question is that the amendments be considered immediately. And now I say I understand that it's the wish of the House to consider the amendments together. The amendments be considered immediately. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. Order. The question is that the amendments be considered immediately. The member for Wentworth.
Mr Speaker, we oppose these amendments being considered immediately. These are very, very substantial amendments to the NBN legislation. Let there be no mistake about that. These are not minor or technical amendments introduced by the Senate to correct matters of detail. These are sweeping amendments that were introduced into the Senate not by the crossbenchers, not by the opposition, but by a fundamentally, thoroughly dysfunctional and incompetent government that, after months and months of discussing this legislation with the community, through committees, with the industry, chose to bring in dramatic changes to the legislation that were so substantial that they set the entire telecommunications industry into a furor. Now, those amendments were produced on Wednesday, late on Wednesday, and they would have had, and they still do have, the impact of giving the NBN enormous independent power without regard to the jurisdiction and the supervision of the APPROPRIATIon. And what this was, Mr Acting Speaker, was nothing more than a grab for power by the NBN and its owner, this incompetent and dysfunctional and disorganised Labor government. Now, these amendments that came in on Wednesday night, it is worth considering the history of them, because they were produced on Wednesday night or circulated. I can't even say that they were tabled in the Senate, but they certainly, a copy was made available. And immediately the telecommunications industry went into a furor because they could see that what was happening now was precisely what we predicted in this place again and again. We have said from the outset that this NBN will not be a wholesale-only common carrier, free to all, a harmless public utility conferring blessings on all mankind. Oh no, this is going to be a great big government-owned monopoly, massively overcapitalised, and as a consequence it will need to find revenues wherever it can. And the most obvious place to find them is by moving into the business of the private sector telcos, in particular the corporate and government businesses of the telcos. So it was in this House that we moved a very straightforward amendment that would have made it impossible or unlawful for the NBN to supply carriage services to any person with a carrier's licence that was not providing a service to the public. And yet that amendment was rejected. And the consequence of that, as we noted last week, was that the NBN would be able to provide broadband services, connectivity, to corporations, to governments, indeed to anybody who could get a carrier's licence, and they are literally a matter of paying a few $1,000s. Anyone who can get a carrier's licence could then, with the investment of a few tens of thousands of dollars into electronic equipment, could then create their own private network. And what big company, what government department, what local government would not take advantage of that? The consequence being, of course, is that Telstra and Optus and Macquarie Telecom and Vocus and Primus and all of the carriers that are marketing themselves, offering themselves to that government and corporate market will be out of business. And the bottom line is that the NBN will be the sole monopoly fixed-line broadband carrier in Australia. That's the government's intent. It will dominate the corporate and government market for telecommunications, and the only area where it will not be dealing directly with customers will be in the area of residences or residential customers and presumably small businesses. If I may say, Mr Acting Speaker, very small businesses indeed, because the complexity, or should I say the simplicity, the plug-and-play simplicity of modern electronics enables any customer very quickly who is provided with a Layer 2 service, a Layer 2 connectivity from a carrier like NBN, to quickly create a private network for themselves. Now, the government would say, what's so wrong about that? Well, what is wrong with that is that is essentially pushing the private sector out of the market. It is doing so via the NBN, which has the benefit of tens and tens of billions of dollars of taxpayers' subsidy, and it will have the effect or the ultimate outcome of re-establishing the monopoly dominance in telecommunications of the old Postmaster General's Department or the old Telecom. It is turning back the clock in terms of economic reform and telecommunications reform, and it is doing so at enormous expense, at absolutely massive expense. Now, these amendments, particularly those to the Access Bill, the second bill, are very significant because of the way they take away from the ACCC their ability to oversee the NBN. They are also extremely complex, and we know that they were drafted and redrafted in the dead of night in the Department of Broadband and Communications on Wednesday night and Thursday night and through Friday. And so confused and chaotic was the government's situation with these amendments that it had to filibuster its own bill in the Senate while it was trying to cobble together some language. Now, Mr Acting Speaker, if the government, with all of its resources, with all of its expertise, is in confusion and disarray and does not understand the consequences of this legislation, how absurd is it? How absurd is it for this House to be asked to deliberate on this legislation and finalise this legislation this morning when we have only had the amendments over the weekend? We did not know what these amendments were until Friday evening, and there is a whole industry that is confused, appalled, troubled by these amendments, and they are entitled to, as indeed all Australians are, the time to consider them carefully. There is no urgency in bringing these bills on today. The government will say, oh, Telstra has to have its shareholders' meeting. Well, that was the argument used at the end of last year. But Telstra has agreed or acknowledged that it's not going to have its shareholders' meeting by the 1st of July, and Telstra's timetable, if you like, shouldn't be determining the timetable of this House. Now, Mr Acting Speaker, let me remind the House of the magnitude of this matter. This is not a minor project. This is the largest infrastructure project in our nation's history. It will involve the investment of about $50 billion of taxpayers' money. Government hopes that the net expense will be somewhat less than that, but that assumes some very optimistic revenue forecasts coming true. And as we all know, the sad lesson of life is that such forecasts like that rarely do come true. This project is going to revolutionise, and not for good, the telecommunication sector in Australia. It is going to create a massive government-owned monopoly, which, as I said earlier, will not simply provide a wholesale carriage service for other telecom companies to use, but will move directly into dealing with governments and with corporations, and will not be limited to just large corporations. There is no limit to the extent to which the NBN can deal direct. And I'll predict now that if this legislation is passed and if the NBN is established before long, they will be offering even quite small businesses a telco-in-a-box product. And they'll say, here's the layer 2 connectivity. Here is the gear you need to buy to enable that, the switches and routers you need to buy to enable that. Here are the various other carriers that can provide backhaul for you. And that will all be provided as a package. And how does a Telstra, even a mighty Telstra, cashed up with its $11 billion, let alone an Optus or the smaller telcos, Macquarie Telecom and others, how do they compete with the NBN? Because the basic connectivity that they will be offering their corporate customers is being provided by the NBN direct without the added expense of a middleman, of an RSP. So this is a government takeover of the telecommunications sector. It is also, Mr Acting Speaker, unique in the world. There is no country in the world that is investing money at this scale in a national broadband network. Not one. Not one. The government talks about Korea. I remember the Prime Minister saying we can't let the Koreans get ahead of us in IT. Well, in Korea, they do not have a government-owned monopoly broadband provider. They do not have, or very rarely have, fibre to the home. It is in fact a fibre to the node system, so it's quite a different system to that which the government is proposing here. And above all, and as the Korean Communications Commission emphasised when I was visiting with them 2 weeks ago, that a key part of their policy is ensuring facilities-based competition. So the aim and the object of their policy is that in the basement of every apartment block there are several carriers, at least one, often two or more fibre providers, a HFC cable provider and others, and they seek to maintain and promote facilities-based competition. And that is a policy objective everywhere else in the world. And yet here we have, in other parts of these amendments, in other elements of these amendments, we have cherry-picking provisions which have been amended in the Senate, which are designed to ensure that the NBN is effectively a fixed-line monopoly. And why is that? What's the object of that? The object, as clearly stated in the NBN's business case, in the McKinsey study, in all of the utterances of the government and the NBN, the object is simply to protect the economics of the NBN. So this is going right back to the days, the bad old days, when state governments owned businesses which, whether it was a butcher shop or a brickworks or a railway, and then regulated and legislated to make it impossible for the private sector to compete with it, for no reason other than preserving the profitability of the state government-owned business. So this is a massive change. Now, I mentioned Korea Another country that is very committed to ICT, obviously not strictly comparable to Australia because of its size, is Singapore, but forging ahead with ICT. In Singapore, they are absolutely committed to facilities-based competition. Their national broadband carrier, their fibre carrier, which will not be government-owned, is not government-owned, will be subject to facilities-based competition, both in the residential sector and, above all, with business. Very, very vigorous competition. And that, again, when you speak, as I did when I spoke to the Singaporean regulators, to the legislators, to ministers, they all said the same thing. Here we believe in competition. We believe that there has to be facilities-based competition. Service-level competition is not enough. And of course, to rub real salt into the wound of Australians who believe in free markets and competition, when I was discussing this very project in the People's Republic of China only a few weeks back, they were amazed, as all the parties I met in my travels in Asia, about the size of the investment, but above all, about the way in which this is going to be a monopoly provider. And they asked me about it. They couldn't believe it. And then finally they said, thoughtfully and respectfully, well, that's very interesting, but in China we really believe that you must have competitive markets in telecommunications. So even in the People's Republic of China, they are not prepared to undertake a project as monstrously monopolistic as this one. So this is a gigantic project. These legislative amendments that the senators have resolved on in a rush, frankly with inadequate consideration in the Senate, as our colleagues observed, those amendments deserve proper consideration, they deserve proper time, and we should not be considering them today.
Order. The member for Sturt.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I do rise to speak on this particular motion that the amendments be dealt with immediately, for the very simple reason that while it's unorthodox for the opposition to debate this particular motion, we are absolutely appalled that the government would, on Wednesday night and then on Friday night, introduce a raft of very technical and very serious and far-reaching amendments to the National Broadband Network bills that will have real consequence without allowing the opposition and the minor parties the proper time to consider and debate these amendments. The Leader of the House and I, last Wednesday, facilitated the passing through the House of Representatives of these bills. In fact, the Chief Whip asked members of the opposition if they would truncate their time speaking on these bills in order to allow them to pass so they could be dealt with in the Senate for commercial reasons that the Leader of the House asked me to take into consideration in allowing that to happen. They were described to me at the time as being non-controversial bills. And I have to give, I think, the Leader of the House the benefit of the doubt. While it's unusual, I will give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he was as misled by the Minister for Communications, Senator Conroy, as he then misled me. Because in the House of Representatives, these bills were passed without a vote. These bills were considered by the House of Representatives to be non-controversial. There was not a division called on these bills. There might have been on an amendment of the opposition, but not on there was a division on the amendment, but not on the substance of the bills, and they moved into the Senate. It was only then, Mr Deputy Speaker, once they reached the Senate, that we discovered the real plan of the government, which was like not quite as bad as Pearl Harbor. Let's not engage in the hyperbole that the government likes to engage in, but it certainly was a surprise attack on the Senate and on the opposition. 23 pages of very substantial amendments that have far-reaching consequences for the National Broadband Network were moved in the Senate by the government. It was expected, the government expected the Senate to pass those with less than 24 hours to do so. The Senate sat through Thursday night and Friday and into Friday night to hold the government to account and scrutinise these amendments. The government didn't expect that to happen. They had simply expected, and I don't blame the House of Representatives for this, I blame the Minister for Communications. The Minister for Communications had simply expected the Senate to rubber stamp 23 pages of far-reaching amendments to a very substantial, in fact the most substantial, public works in Australia's history. But then the story even gets worse, Mr Deputy Speaker, because on Friday night, because of the incompetence and ineptness of the Minister for Communications, the government scheduled more amendments to be debated and passed in the Senate on Friday and Friday night. Such is the manifest inadequacy of the Minister for Communications, Senator Conroy, that we had to, the opposition had to, in the Senate, keep the debate going so that he could get his act together and introduce amendments on Friday night. Now, our view is those amendments should have sat on the table to be introduced on Friday and to be debated at a future time. That was our view. That's what should have happened. Instead, the Senate debated these amendments and the outcome is such that we are here on Monday debating changes and requests and amendments from the Senate. But the fact remains, Mr Deputy Speaker, that on Wednesday night and on Friday night, the government introduced far-reaching amendments which they expected to be rubber-stamped by both Houses of Parliament, and that is why we meet today, and that is why the opposition says we will not support debating these amendments immediately. We will not support this debate occurring today. We believe that this debate should occur at a future sitting of the House of Representatives when the opposition, and therefore the Parliament, has the opportunity to properly consider and hold to account a government that is so manifestly inept that they cannot get their act together on what is the most far-reaching change to our infrastructure, the most expensive in Australia's history. And I remind the House, Mr Deputy Speaker, of the costs involved. This national broadband network is going to cost $27 billion in equity funding. A further $10 billion is expected to be borrowed by NBN Co. to roll out the network, and $11 billion, or equal to roughly $16 billion in actual transfers, are being paid to Telstra to sign up to this deal. Therefore, it's around $50 billion is commonly used as the amount of money that the NBN is going to cost the Australian taxpayer. $50 billion of taxpayers' money will be used to set up a new government monopoly in telecommunications. It is unprecedented in the world today. Nobody else in the world, Mr Deputy Speaker, is establishing a telecommunications monopoly like this one in order to be able to deliver broadband to people's homes. Not North Korea, not Cuba, not South Africa, no country in the world is adopting this policy. Only in Australia would you get a Labor government that would be prepared to spend $50 billion of taxpayers' money to establish a new telecommunications monopoly in 2011 for the future. The Coalition believes it can be done much more efficiently, much more cheaply and much more effectively. And we have a policy that the Shadow Minister for Communications has been advocating for months, which would achieve broadband speeds to the home at a fraction of the cost and use the whole gamut of technologies that are available, leaving open the opportunity for changing technologies into the future, and reduce the cost to the taxpayer by an enormous amount of money, and include the private sector rather than this new telecommunications monopoly giant. And so, Mr Deputy Speaker, we do not support debating these bills immediately. What we do support is the government recalling the Parliament. And yes, I do say to the Leader of the House, I do take his interjection. We do believe the Parliament should sit again. It's not our fault. It's not our fault that the government has only scheduled 17 sitting weeks. That was a decision that the Leader of the House and the government made. We are elected to be in federal Parliament. We are elected to be in federal Parliament. When I was first elected, we sat for 22 weeks a year. This year we will sit for 17 weeks. It is the responsibility of members of the federal parliament to sit in the parliament and deal with the legislation, the motions, the amendments, the question times and so forth that are part and parcel of being a member of the House of Representatives. It is not the job of members of federal parliament to find ways to truncate the sittings of the House and return to their electorates. We already sit in our electorates for most of the year, and yet the government, because it didn't want the parliament to sit in a hung parliament, because the government is frightened of the parliament, because the government sometimes loses votes in the parliament, because the opposition is a more effective opposition than the government is a government in this place, because the Leader of the House knows that we will present a phalanx of accountability and scrutiny to the government every day the parliament sits. The Labor Party wants the parliament to sit as little as possible, and this year we will sit for 17 weeks. It is the lowest in a non-election year in the time that I have been in Parliament, which will surprise some people to know is 18 years. It is the shortest period of time in many decades that the Parliament would sit in a non-election period. And so we say to the government, return to the Parliament when these amendments can be properly taken into consideration, scrutinised, and the government can be held to account. We won't be rushing this debate through today. We won't be sitting here and simply allowing the government to ride roughshod over the process of scrutiny and accountability that is the House of Representatives. And the Leader of the House knows that. He is a better man than this. He does respect the Parliament. He does know the Parliament needs to sit to scrutinise legislation, to scrutinise amendments. And so does the member for Kennedy, who is a long-standing member of this Parliament and the Queensland Parliament. He knows the role of the Parliament in holding governments to account. He was a member of the Bjelke-Petersen government. He knows how important it was that the Parliament sat to hold the government of Joh Bjelke-Petersen to account in Queensland. And he was a minister in that government, so he would never support rushing through this Parliament amendments that need to be properly scrutinised and held up to the light. I mean, this is the government with a Prime Minister. This is a government with a Prime Minister, Mr Deputy Speaker, who said that every decision that comes to the Cabinet, she holds up to the light. She looks at every corner. She reaches into the dark recesses of every decision being made by the government to root out all the dark and dangerous spots to make sure that every decision being made is being made correctly. As my colleague says, the Prime Minister who said, let the sunshine in. The sunshine is the best antiseptic for government. And yet, she is part of a government that today is trying to consider amendments, 23 pages of amendments that were handed down in the Senate on Wednesday and Friday. She's expecting the Parliament to rubber stamp those today in order to get these amendments through. And we in the Coalition say no, we will not support a rubber stamping of these amendments today. We will hold them up to account. We'll hold them up to the light. We'll let the sunshine into the dark recesses, the grubby, unattractive, dark recesses of this Labor government, in order to ensure that the right decisions are being made for the Australian people. And if only that level of accountability had been visited on the New South Wales Labor Party, they might not be sitting here today in this Parliament with more coalition members of Parliament elected across Australia today in total than members of the Labor Party. That is what Labor faces today. They face opposition in Western Australia, in Victoria, in New South Wales, a smashed and broken Labor Party in New South Wales. They have done that because they got too big for their boots, Mr Deputy Speaker, because of their arrogance, because of their inability to understand that they are supposed to be representing the people, because they decided that instead they represented the union movement, and they represented special interest, and they represented local developers, and they represented their own passionate desire to hang on and to gain power. And that is why the New South Wales voters woke up to the New South Wales Labor Party and have smashed them on Saturday. And the same thing will happen to this government in Canberra, unless it pauses, takes a breath, and recognises that trying to drag the Parliament back on a Monday like today, rather than scheduling proper sittings throughout the year, trying to force amendments through in the dark of night last Wednesday in the Senate and again on Friday, that is exactly the kind of behaviour that caused the New South Wales Labor Party to find their political lives terminated on Saturday in so many cases. And it is the same attitude that brought Christina Keneally to the point where, as Premier of New South Wales, she ensured the Parliament didn't sit from late last year, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, until this election. It's the same arrogance that made her believe that she could stop an investigation and an inquiry into New South Wales privatisation by stopping the Parliament from sitting and parliamentary committees from sitting. And the voters of New South Wales delivered their verdict on Saturday, and that is the same arrogance that the Labor Party brings to this House in expecting the opposition to pass amendments to complicated bills, amendments that are technical in nature, amendments that have far-reaching changes to the way the national broadband network operates in this country. We in the opposition do not support the amendments being debated immediately. We believe the government should properly schedule sittings of the House to ensure that the Parliament can do its work. That is the work of the House of Representatives. That's why we come to Canberra to get elected. We come to scrutinise the government if we are in opposition, and if we are in government, we come to deliver good policy outcomes for Australia, and that is not happening in this government led by the member for Lawler. And I hope that I'm right, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I hope that I'm right, that the Leader of the House didn't mislead me last week, because for all his faults, which are manifest, he is not known for misleading the manager of opposition business, because he knows the result from that is an impossible-to-manage House. I'm assuming that he was misled by the incompetent Minister for Communications and then misled me about the non-controversial nature of these bills. But this is his opportunity to stand up in the House and to explain to the House why they should be considered, these amendments should be considered immediately. And my sense is that he would rather the Parliament sit again later in this session to get these amendments right, because he knows that the only way to ensure good legislation is passed is to let the sun shine in as the best antiseptic to bad government.
Order. I call the member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And you have to ask the question that as to whether bringing the House back today, what does that say about the project management of the National Broadband Network? The fact that we have 23 pages of amendments being introduced into the Senate at a minute to midnight, what does that say about how the rest of the project is being managed? The fact that the minister responsible is unable to get his legislation up before these Houses of Parliament in an organised manner, in a manner which allows proper debate of the very important issues that are before this Parliament, certainly is reason for concern. And in fact, it's interesting to note that amongst our amendments we have an extension of the completion date. Admittedly, an extension that was foreshadowed in the business plan, but we have a project, the largest project in the history of this country, the most expensive project in the history of this country, the largest piece of government expenditure in Australia's history, and in its infancy it is already being the subject of time delays. And one thing that comes with time delays, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that it always increases the cost. Every time you have a time blowout, it always increases the cost. We have a project that is now looking at down the barrel of $50 billion of government expenditure, and the legislation for that $50 billion of expenditure is not being considered in the usual way before this House with proper and reasoned debate. The legislation or the amendments are being rushed in at a minute to midnight, and to the detriment of the proper function of this House. I'd have to say, Deputy Speaker, that this government has a history of delay. I mean, on coming to office, it cancelled the Opel contract, which would have delivered high-speed broadband to regional and rural Australia. That project would have been completed at a fraction of the cost of the NBN. We would have been delivering high-speed broadband to people in regional and rural areas by the 30th of June 2009. By the 30th of June 2009, some of the places where services were worse would have been fixed. And what have we got with this project? We've had a delay in the legislation to the point that this minister can't even get his legislation before the House in a timely manner which would allow appropriate debate. And you have to ask the question about the independents in this House, Mr. Deputy Speaker, whether they are truly representing the interests of the people who sent them to Canberra, whether they're truly representing those interests. The fact that Opel could have delivered better quality services to their constituencies by the 30th of June 2009 has to raise questions about where their allegiances lie, Mr Deputy Speaker, whether they are supporting the people who sent them to Canberra, or whether they are in fact just propping up the government. And that is a very important issue, and one I think that there was some reflection on over the weekend with the result in the New South Wales election, where we saw the country independents suffer massive swings, the country independents largely swept from office as a result, in no small part, by the actions of the New South Wales country independents in this place. And we'll certainly be watching how they vote during the course of the day on the matters that will be before this House. We'll certainly be watching their actions in the months ahead in relation to delivery of communication services for the people that they represent. But it certainly is a concern, Mr Deputy Speaker, that within this legislation we don't have the promised uniformity of wholesale pricing across this country effectively. We might have it uniformity within technologies, but we certainly don't have an ironclad guarantee that we are going to get uniform wholesale prices right across the country. Because if you access broadband via satellite, or if you access broadband via wireless, when speeds exceed 12 megabits a second, which they most certainly will in the years ahead, there is no guarantee what a person who receives a service through wireless or through satellite will be paying. And that is of great concern. That is of great concern to the people that I represent. It is of great concern to the people that the member for Maranoa represents. It is of great concern to the Nationals and the Liberals in coalition that there may well be a huge digital divide in relation to the pricing that is paid for those users who aren't connected to the fibre optic network. A very great concern indeed, and we will see the way that the New South Wales country independents vote on this matter during the course of the day. We will see whether they are actually going to support the people that sent them to Canberra, or whether they are going to once again, as they almost invariably do, prop up the government. It is a very important issue. We have seen them time and time again vote to support an incompetent government rather than voting to support the people who sent them to Canberra, and that is a very grave concern indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. We have concerns about the many needs in regional and rural areas, and the big question that exists is a $50 billion expenditure. Is that the best use of government resources and taxpayers' money? A $50 billion expenditure? What is the opportunity cost of that expenditure? What other priorities in regional and rural areas could have been fulfilled, as well as the provision of high-speed broadband? Because the Coalition believes most firmly that we can deliver high-speed broadband that is going to meet the communications needs of people in regional and rural areas and get change from the $50 billion that the government is proposing to spend at some significant capital loss to the taxpayers, because the value created by their misinformed scheme is certainly going to result in a capital loss to the taxpayer. And it's certainly a question that the New South Wales independents should be asking themselves: is this the best use of $50 billion of taxpayers' money? What other services could be provided in regional and rural Australia for this money? Is there going to be access for people with regards to those users of satellite and wireless? Are they going to get an equivalent wholesale price as the speeds increase above 12 megabits a second, as they almost invariably will? But the real concern, Deputy Speaker, is that this project, only in its infancy, is showing signs that cracks are appearing in the way that it is managed. The way this legislation is being rushed into the House at a minute to midnight tells us a lot about the rest of the project. It tells us a lot about the rest of the project. It tells us that they can't even manage the first phases of the project. How are they going to deliver a completed project? How are they going to deliver a completed project on time and on budget? Well, I've got to say that this government's ability to deliver within budget, they certainly don't have a proud record, Deputy Speaker. We've seen it with pink bats. We've seen it with computers in schools. We've seen it in every area of this government's operation. They can't keep a project on time and on budget, and we see with this legislation that it's rushed in at a minute to midnight, that it hasn't been properly considered by the government and the minister itself. let alone it hasn't been properly considered by the government and the minister itself, let alone had the chance to be properly debated within this place. Deputy Speaker, I know that people in regional and rural areas want faster broadband. We all know that. We all know the importance of such a facility. We know the importance to our constituency, but we also know the importance of value for money. Value for money and the many needs that are out there in regional and rural areas. And I would hope that the rural independents would think very carefully in this debate today, because we'll certainly be raising an amendment that is going to consider the issue of uniform wholesale pricing and ensuring that there is equity for the people that we represent, ensuring that as technology changes and as speed improves, that you won't be disadvantaged as a satellite customer and you won't be disadvantaged as a wireless customer in relation to cost. And that's a very important factor, that the digital divide needs to be bridged, but that there needs to be equity of pricing, and the current legislation does not guarantee equity of pricing. It does not guarantee equity of pricing, Deputy Speaker, and that is a really great concern. And the New South Wales independents will have the ability today in this place to show whether they support regional and rural Australia or whether they're just merely supporting the government. And all too sadly, that has been their track record, and the public has seen that, Deputy Speaker. The public has seen them in action. They have seen that when it comes to the crunch, which way are they going to vote? Do they vote in support of their constituents, or do they vote in support of the government? Well, sadly, time after time after time after time, they vote to prop up the government. They don't vote to support their constituents. And they will be judged, Deputy Speaker. They will be judged. They will be judged when there is a community in need of a particular piece of infrastructure, because if they support this $50 billion white elephant, the public will know that these are funds that could be better spent in other areas. The public will know that you could provide high-speed broadband and still have funds over for other priorities. It will be up to them to explain to their electorates why they are missing out on other essential infrastructure, because money is being wasted on this project. And the delay in introducing this legislation into this House is just a symptom of the mismanagement of the National Broadband Network. We see the delay already in finalising the agreement with Telstra. One of the very first steps in this project, the government has been unable to see the announcement even of a vote in relation to the purchase of and the lease over Telstra's interest in its infrastructure. It could have critical ramifications. It could have critical ramifications for the ongoing project. It could have critical ramifications for the final cost of the project. And yet at this early stage, at square one, we see the government failing to come to an agreement with Telstra on time, such that the agreement with Telstra has not, or date has not been set for a vote by Telstra shareholders on the agreement with the government. So that is something that should be concerning taxpayers. What is this going to cost them? What is this delay going to cost them? What is going to be the prolongation cost as more and more money is poured into this project? We really do have some concerns, Deputy Speaker, and the situation that we have here in this House, the fact that this House had to be brought back for an extra day of sittings because the responsible minister was not even competent enough to get his amendments in on time so that they could be debated in the proper course and under the usual sittings of this House, certainly does raise concerns for many, many people. For many, many people indeed. And certainly when you're looking at a project of this magnitude, the Australian taxpayer demands and should have better project management from the responsible minister than we've seen to this date, because it is the taxpayers of this country that will be footing the bill for Labor's incompetence. We saw on the weekend in New South Wales the people passed judgment on Labor incompetence. They were also passing judgment on the carbon tax, and that's another story, but they were passing judgment on Labor incompetence. They were passing judgment on Labor's failure to deliver. And also at a federal level, we see the same sorts of strategy of spin and the same sorts of strategies of mismanagement being implemented here in the infancy of this government, and we will see very much the fate of this government, I suggest, going the same way through the failure of this government to deliver for the constituents that they are representing. Because they have a responsibility as stewards of taxpayers' money to ensure that funds are dispersed wisely, to ensure that funds are properly dispersed to provide quality outcomes. Yet we see here that we're going to have a situation where people in regional and rural areas are unfortunately potentially going to be paying far more for an equivalent service than those in metropolitan areas or those on the fibre optic network. We will be, during the course of the day, moving an amendment that is going to ensure equity, across technologies, because we are concerned that this digital divide is going to be widened by the passing of this bill, and we will be certainly fighting very hard on behalf of the people that we represent in this House. I would hope that the New South Wales Country Independents take that on board. I would hope that they support these amendments. We have seen in the recent New South Wales election the judgment that has been passed on their performance to date, and we saw Mr Turnbull, the member for Northern Tablelands, drawing a very clear comparison between the result in New South Wales and the performance of the New South Wales Country Independents. And he said that for an individual to try and claim that there was no correlation, that they would have to be clearly delusional. They would have to be delusional, Mr Deputy Speaker. So there is, I think, a wide gap opening up between the views of the member for New England and the member for Northern Tablelands as to the perceived quality of the performance of the New South Wales Country Independents in this place. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, it is a very important debate we're having in the House today. It is one that has been rushed. It is one that should have been given the appropriate amount of time to allow proper consideration of the things before this House. But one thing is for certain, that the Coalition will be fighting to ensure equity of access to high-quality broadband. We'll be fighting to ensure that the interests of regional and rural Australians are upheld in this place, despite the incompetence of this minister introducing 23 pages of amendments at a minute to midnight and not allowing the proper consideration of this legislation which it rightly deserves.
Order. I call the member for Wide Bay and Leader of the National. I call the Leader of Government Business.
Mr Deputy Speaker, this is an extraordinary attempt.
No, your Leader of the Government Business.
No, I haven't spoken yet.
This will close the debate, because we're considering that the amendments be considered immediately, not any amendment.
Well, I've got the call.
No. I gave it to the member for Wide Bay and I indicated you wanted to call for perhaps a point of order or some other.
No. Well, he can go next, and then I'll. That's right.
Well, thank you very much.
I'll now call the member for Wide Bay as I
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The NBN was born out of the Labor's spin machine. It's been all about rhetoric, which has been excessively lavish, but delivery has been abysmal. The reality is that this was an idea that was dreamt up when people were thinking of, within the Labor Party machine, the New South Wales Labor right was no doubt at the core of all this, as it was in everything within the Labor Party over recent times, was looking for extraordinary, over-the-top election promises to pretend that the Rudd government, if it came into power, would be a government of vision that would deliver real things to the Australian people. And so they made a very clear, very precise, very carefully articulated election promise. It had more detail in than most Labor promises. And to summarise it, they said that after their election in 2007, that Labor would deliver fibre to the node, broadband speeds of up to 100 megabits per second to 98% of Australians. 98% of Australians were going to get fibre to the node at speeds of up to 100 megabits per second. And once more, the first connections would be made by Christmas 2008. They also said the cost of this magnificent project would be $4.7 billion. Shortly after the election, Prime Minister Rudd in this House reaffirmed that Labor intended to honour all of its election promises, including the promise to deliver broadband speeds of 100 megabits per second to 98% of Australians commencing from Christmas 2008 at a cost of $4.7 billion. The promise was repeated, but in reality there was never a plan to deliver it. The plan was never realistic. Where it came from, who knows? But the reality was it could never be delivered. It was a dishonest promise made to the Australian people. If Labor didn't know that it was undeliverable, then that simply demonstrated their incompetence in the field. They didn't understand what they were asking for, they didn't understand what they were promising, and not surprisingly, they couldn't deliver. Now, bit by bit, the policy has changed. There was another then grand announcement so that the situation had changed. Instead of being delivered to 98% of the population, Labor decided that they would deliver fibre to the home to only 93% of the population. There was no chance of meeting the Christmas 2008 deadline. In fact, it's blown out for years and years. And in discussions over recent days, it's clear that it's blown out even further. Once more, the price had drifted from $4.7 billion to $47 billion. The decimal place had been moved.
That's what I call a
Not just a simple typo, from $4.7 billion to $47 billion. And of course the price is still going up. Who knows what it would eventually cost? And it looks like it's at least 8 years away before most people will get any connections at all. And of course under this scheme, 2 million Australians miss out on the fibre to the home commitment altogether. Labor just walked away from those people as though they didn't matter. The price went up tenfold, but the number of people actually getting the 100 megabit speed has been reduced. And that's the nature of Labor in government. The promise completely dishonoured for 2 million Australians. And of course I care about those 2 million Australians because they're mostly from regional communities. Now I know Labor doesn't care much about people who live outside the capitals, but these 2 million people who've been slashed from Labor's promise, they're out of sight. They live in remote communities and therefore they don't matter, and Labor doesn't care. Now what in fact is particularly annoying is that Labor, when they came to office, cancelled the Opal contract that had been signed by the previous government. This was a plan already in place that had been through tendering processes. There are a number of parties offering to build it, and the contract was awarded to the Opal consortium. That consortium would have been delivering broadband to all Australians up to 12 megabits per second by now. Everyone would have it. While Labor was talking, the coalition had acted, and the coalition's program was in place for delivery. But Labor cancelled the contract. They said they had a better way. But the better way hasn't happened. And it doesn't look like happening, and Labor still doesn't know how it's going to deliver it. And that is clearly apparent by the fact that they bring 23 pages of amendments to their own legislation into the Parliament several years after they announced the program. Several years after they announced their NBN program. They didn't know what they were doing when they made the announcement, and they clearly don't know what they're doing today. The Opal would have delivered to all Australians for less than $1 billion of government commitment. $1 billion of government commitment. We don't know how much of the $47 to $50 billion the taxpayers are going to have to pick up for the NBN, but we do know it's tens of billions of dollars. Tens of billions of dollars. And who knows whether that will ever deliver the value that the government says. Now, one of the reasons the government gave for axing the Opal contract was it was only going to deliver 12 megabits per second and it was dependent upon wireless. That wasn't good enough, we were told. You had to have fibre optic cable for everyone. And so they axed the contract. But when it comes to country people, that's all Labor's going to offer under their $47 billion scheme. They're still only going to get wireless or satellite coverage. 12 megabits is enough for people who live in country areas, according to Labor. The 100 megabits per second is only going to be a promise to people who live in the more densely populated areas. And when we hear the Labor Party's rhetoric about how vital it is to have this speed if we're going to be a modern economy, how vital it is to connect the whole of Australia, and then they say, well, for country people, that doesn't apply to you. You don't need these higher speeds. That is clearly an insult and a demonstration of where this government's priorities are. They talk often about a two-speed economy, but writers talk about two-speed economies, and they're referring to the development in inland parts or in the mining areas of particularly Queensland and Western Australia that are doing well. But there's also another two-speed economy that this government is inventing. That is, those who can have 100 megabit speeds and those who can't. Those who are only deserving of 12 megabit speeds. Now, the other thing that the government tells us is that this 100 megabits is going to be just wonderful stuff because it will enable things like fast connections to schools and fast connections for telemedicine and the like. But the very communities that need the telemedicine, that don't have the doctors, they're the ones in the remote communities who are not covered by the promise. They're the ones that are going to be left out. The small country communities that really need the capacity to link into the best technology and make contact with city specialists and the like are those who live in little country towns. And all they're offered is wireless. So this government has not thought it through, or even the remote schools, where educational achievements are way below the national average. It is an embarrassment to our country that people who go to schools in small country areas have such poor academic achievements, whether it be in reading, writing and arithmetic, or for that matter, their capacity to get through to university and obtain university degrees. The very people who need these speeds, who need the opportunity to connect to the best systems in the world, are the ones who are not going to get it. Now, Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, the reality is that this whole program has been a tragedy for people who live in regional areas. Not only do they not have their Opal broadband connections by now as they should, but other development within the telecommunications sectors have been stalled. Labor axed the black spot program for filling in mobile telecommunications black spots. They refused to fund it, even though it was recommended by the reports that were done into the telecommunications services, and there are still hundreds of black spots around, particularly in rural communities. I have been pressing for ages to get a mobile phone coverage for a little town called Widgie in my electorate. They were close to the top of the list under the previous government's black spots program, and most certainly would have got mobile phone coverage well and truly by now. But the government axed this program. When I wrote to the minister about it, he wrote back to me and he said, well, we've axed that program because we are instead going to deliver the NBN network, fast broadband speeds. However, Widgie will never get the high-speed broadband that Labor's talking about. They probably won't even get wireless. And yet the government has axed the program that would at least give these people mobile phone coverage. There has been a complete stalling of the provision of infrastructure in the telecommunications field for those people where the installations are not profitable to the telecommunications companies. Telstra won't spend the money because they don't know what their future is. And Optus and others have all been held in abeyance because they don't know where the government's NBN program is going to end up. So country people have missed out twice. They haven't got the Opal coverage they should have. They haven't got the continuation of the black spots programs that the previous government was providing across the nation. And now, to add insult to injury, they're left out of the NBN promise of 100 megabit speeds through fibre optic cable. So this is a government that has misled all Australians, because it's failed to deliver the NBN as they promised they would, on time, on budget, on schedule. They have broken each of the commitments that they made in that regard, but in particular they've betrayed regional Australians who will be left out as a part of this massive expenditure, and the people who need it most will not get the speeds that they need to connect to the rest of the world.
Question is that the amendments be considered immediately. I call the member for McKellar.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In speaking to this motion that was moved by the Manager of Government Business, insisting that the House consider these extensive amendments that have been made in the Senate to two bills, the National Broadband Network Companies Bill and the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment National Broadband Network Measures Access Arrangements Bill, both of 2010-2011 respectively. I want to argue very soundly, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it is totally unreasonable that to debate the complexity that is in these amendments, and which literally constitute 1/3, in the case of the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Bill, 1/3 of the size of the bill itself in highly complex amendments. Now, normally, when a government is introducing complex legislation, it spends time and effort to get the plan right. It includes all the essential ingredients. The bill is prepared, and then finally we see another large document, the explanatory memorandum. Well, this time we've seen come into this House for the purposes of us being recalled to debate this complex legislation, amendments which were literally stitched up on the floor of the Senate from the reports that we read, which have no such explanatory memorandum explaining what the purpose of the amendments are, what the effect is. And if you go and look at the nature of the amendments that are moved, and you just randomly look at page 14, for instance, which is Part 8, Superfast Fixed Line Networks, Introduction, Simplified Outline. The following is a simplified outline of this part. A controller of a telecommunications network other than the National Broadband Network must not use a local access line to supply an eligible service to a person other than a carrier or a service provider if 1. Or A, the local access line is part of the infrastructure of the network, and B, the network is used or is proposed to be used to simplify a superfast carriage service wholly or principally residential or small business customers or prospective residential or small business customers in Australia, and C, the network came into existence or was upgraded on or after the 1st of January 2011. It then goes on for several more pages dealing with definitions until we get to a supply of eligible services to be on a wholesale basis. It deals with highly complex issues, including provisions that will prevent the National Broadband Network Company being subject to the oversighting of the APPROPRIATION. And there's page after page of circumstances set out in complex, as I said, complex legislation. Every now and again we get a box that tells us it's a simplified explanation of what's in the bill. And of course the one I just read out shows just how complex it is, because even the simplified version of it is complex to ordinary folk. Speakers that we have had in speaking to this motion to date have outlined why it is so unfair in terms of looking after all Australians, and how the policy that was taken to the election by the government has been varied since. And I'd like to add a few more points to that too. If we look at the question of new houses, originally all new houses were to be connected to the optic fibre. And that was then read down to, well, no, it'll only be a development of 100 homes, and maybe there'll be retrofitting for the others. The whole point about fitting new homes was supposed to be a cost-cutting or a sensible allocation of costs, but then it is decided that it is too expensive to do it that way, and so there has to be 100 houses that have to be done, and if the development is smaller than that, then the fibre optic cable will not be laid. In the debate that took place before the election, there were many people who said that it was reasonable that we had, including the opposition, that we had a mixture of technologies that would deliver high-speed broadband facility for customers. And indeed, if we look at what has happened, originally it was supposed to be 98% of households that were going to be the beneficiaries of this service. Now that was read down to 93% of people who were to be recipients of this service. If you look at the debate that took place prior to the election, it was said, and particularly in the interests of rural people, that they would be looked after, that they wouldn't get the more expensive delivery service, that no matter what the technology that was to be used, they would not be penalised because they lived in rural and regional areas. Well, now that's also been downgraded. Now you can have 12 megabits per second and you'll be guaranteed a constant price. But eternally, the Prime Minister has spoken about the need for everybody to have 100 megabits and even talked about gigabits. And yet we are now saying or the government is now saying that the guarantee of price will only apply across different technologies for 12 megabits per second. There are many Australians who get by on much less than that, but the whole aim of the rollout of this very, very expensive concept and this very expensive network of billions of dollars was to be that we would be up at the forefront of the world and everybody would have access to at least 100 megabits. Well, I've seen some figures earlier on. I can't quite remember them off the top of my head, but I do recall that the number of people who have taken up the internet, if they're earning in excess of $120,000 a year, is somewhere in the vicinity of 96%. I think if once you come down to people who are earning around $40,000 a year, it drops off quite dramatically to around the 65%. But the reason I'm using those figures is that, in fact, usage and expense of using the higher speeds and connecting to the higher speeds is something that will become more and more apparent. If you wish to be found yourself in Melbourne, for instance, and you were wanting to have 100 megabits, you could have it right now because the coaxial cable has been engineered so that that is available to people who have access to that cable right now. But under this proposal, because we're being given a monopoly situation, that coaxial cable will be illegal for people to use. It'll be a wasted resource. And of course, when we're seeing houses which are supposed to be retrofitted, all the old copper cable will be pulled out of those trenches, and the retrofitting is meant to take place through those existing trenches that belong currently to Telstra. But the reason I've mentioned those 2 points is because this is again a grab for a monopoly. A grab for a monopoly that used to exist under the old PMG and under Telecom, and people can remember vividly how there was never any service that was available. If you wanted an extension put into your home, you had to wait, and invariably it would be delivered on a Saturday morning when there was time and a half paid by way of penalty rates to install the facility. But there was always a wait of weeks or months because there was an attitude that they were the monopoly supplier and they were doing you a favour to let you have that service. It was not your right. And vividly I do remember seeing a letter almost in those terms written when I was Deputy Chair of the Regulations and Ordinances Committee of the Senate, where we were looking at certain regulations that were being made with regard to that monopoly, and the attitude of the monopoly supplier was simply, we're doing you a favour to roll out any services, it is not your right to have it. Well, of course, when we saw competitors in the field, we started to see people were able to have rights, and there were time limits that repairs had to be made to services that were brought in. In other words, when we started to have competition, there was better delivery, there was more efficiency, and people were much better satisfied. But once you go back to the old monopoly, you get that same old attitude of a monopolistic attitude where the customer isn't the person who is considered, it is the monopoly itself and protecting that monopoly. And what better way to see that entrenched than to see provisions put into the amendments to protect the new monopoly from the oversight of the APPROPRIATIon. Madam Deputy Speaker, under the system that the opposition had originally, when in government, proposed to put into place under OPEL, there was indeed the expectation that everybody could reasonably expect to get 12 megabits per second. As I said, there are plenty of people who get by on less than that. In fact, a hell of a lot of people get by on 2.5 megabits per second. But it is not unreasonable, and it was our intention that that speed had to be increased, because as the users become more and more sophisticated, as technology continues to grow and expand, we start to see people wanting to have a greater speed and a greater access to high-speed broadband. So there is never a debate on this side of the House that we shouldn't be delivering that high-speed broadband. It was only ever a debate about how it could be most cost-efficiently and done so that people could, in fact, receive the service that they want. But the debate this morning, as I said, is about whether or not we should be asked to be debating this right now. That's the question. The fact of the matter, as I said, the bill itself, the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Bill that left this House, and as the Leader of Opposition Business explained, we facilitated, in the opposition, we facilitated a speedy passage of the bill so it could go to the Senate, and now we find the government brings back a whole package of amendments which have never been examined in this place, which were a work in progress, to put it kindly, when they were in the Senate, and now it's brought back in here, and there is an anticipation by the government it should be just rubber-stamped by the opposition and allowed to pass into law. Well, you've heard many speakers, and there will be many more, of people who want to express their point of view that when it comes to this area, which is complex, which is difficult, there should be more time given for a proper analysis of precisely what these amendments do to the original bill, which was debated here in this place. And I simply say to you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it is unreasonable of the government to ask that these amendments be considered forthwith. It is reasonable that they lay on the table and let people consider what the impact of them will be.
The question is the amendments be considered immediately. The member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The question before this House is, what is the appropriate way in which we should deal with a set of complex amendments which were made by the Senate in its processes on Thursday and Friday last week? And I want to put to the House that there are several reasons why it is not appropriate to simply move to an immediate consideration of these amendments. I want to argue that the policy scheme surrounding the National Broadband Network, of which these amendments form part, is a scheme of the first importance and of considerable controversy, and it does not therefore make sense to accede to the government's desire to ram through a set of poorly considered amendments. I secondly want to argue that the structure of the amendments that was put in the Senate was extensive in the extreme, and that through no fault of the Senate, the capacity to have reasoned consideration of very detailed amendments, only disclosed by the government last Wednesday, was simply not there. There was simply not the capacity to have the detailed and reasoned consideration which ought properly to have been carried out given the nature of these amendments. Thirdly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to make the point that the impact on the telecommunications industry and on stakeholders in this sector is very substantial, and that is another powerful reason why we ought to give careful, detailed, measured consideration to these amendments rather than simply acceding to the government's request that they be rushed through. And I want fourthly to highlight some of the particular serious policy concerns embodied in these amendments. Madam Deputy Speaker, the first point I want to make is that the scheme surrounding the National Broadband Network is a scheme of great importance and great controversy. You have a government which is pursuing a policy scheme in relation to broadband in this country which reverses 20 years of a bipartisan approach to telecommunications. For 20 years, the priority has been to maximise competition, to unleash the power of competition with a view to delivering the best possible services to end users, rather than seeking, through direct government ownership, to engage in day-to-day provision of telecommunication services. As a core part of that policy direction, in Australia, as in so many other countries around the world, the formerly government-owned telecommunications monopoly Telstra was first opened up to competition and, secondly, was sold into private ownership. What this government is now doing is a scheme of the greatest controversy as it reverses that direction, as it returns to substantial government ownership of a telecommunications company, and as it also seeks to buttress that ownership with a series of very concerning limitations and restrictions on competition in telecommunications. And the amendments that we saw moved in the Senate and passed by the Senate on Thursday and Friday add in a very serious way to the limitations on competition. And in particular, Madam Deputy Speaker, the new Division 16, which has been added to the Competition and Consumer Act, imposes very substantial restrictions on the capacity of the Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, to scrutinise and oversee the conduct of the National Broadband Network Company. For example, it is now the case, under the amendments which have been passed by the Senate, that there is a statutory authorisation of such conduct by NBN Co as refusing to supply a service except at what are called listed points of interconnect. In other words, everywhere else across Australia, the National Broadband Network Company can, with impunity, refuse to provide interconnection. If it is not a so-called listed point of interconnect, then there is no obligation to provide interconnection. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is a fundamental change in the policy principles which have regulated telecommunications in this country for some 20 years. Throughout that period, a core principle has been the principle of any-to-any connectivity. That has been central to the regulatory regime, and yet, at 3 minutes to midnight, or to be more specific, last Wednesday, a new set of amendments were introduced which dramatically reduced the degree to which the National Broadband Network Company is subject to the scrutiny of the ACCC, where it chooses to refuse to provide interconnection otherwise than at listed points of interconnect. Similarly, Madam Deputy Speaker, the National Broadband Network Company is now shielded from the scrutiny of the ACCC where it comes to refusal to supply in the context of bundles. And additionally, the National Broadband Network Company has been handed very wide powers where it can argue that it is doing something because it is necessary to achieve the principle of uniform national pricing. And because the new Section 151DA operates as a statutory authorisation, that effectively shields the National Broadband Network Company from the scrutiny of the ACCC in determining whether there has been anti-competitive conduct under either the general law provisions in the Competition and Consumer Act or under Part 11B, the telecom-specific competition provisions of the Competition and Consumer Act. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the remit of the amendments, which were first revealed last Wednesday and which were passed by the Senate in unseemly haste on Thursday and Friday, is very, very broad. As a corollary of that, the degree to which there was able to be appropriate scrutiny and consideration of these amendments was modest indeed. You need merely look at the list of Senate amendments which has been prepared, which lists the number of those amendments which were amendments moved by Senator Xenophon. Now, I certainly do not criticise Senator Xenophon for a second. On the contrary, I congratulate him for his assiduous efforts to try and correct a deeply flawed legislative scheme, a scheme which is deliberately intended to allow the National Broadband Network Company to amass extraordinary market power and to exercise that power quite independent, quite free, quite protected from the scrutiny of the ACCC. I congratulate Senator Xenophon for his assiduous efforts to correct a deeply flawed set of amendments. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do ask this question. What has gone wrong when the government is moving at very late notice very detailed provisions which are manifestly flawed and where it falls to one independent member of the Senate to try and make some corrections? I do also want to put on record my admiration for my coalition colleagues in the Senate who worked assiduously to seek to improve this ramshackle and inadequate set of provisions. Senator Birmingham, Senator Fisher, Senator McDonald and many others in the Senate worked extremely hard to try and correct the gaping flaws in this legislative package. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the point I am making is this. When we have had legislation rammed through at such short notice, when there has been so little time for consideration of the merits of these very detailed measures, when it is only thanks to the work of an independent senator who has sought to make some last-minute corrections at very short notice with the limited resources available to him, does that not say to us that we have here a legislative package which could benefit enormously from some calm reflection, from some detailed analysis of whether the provisions actually work or whether, as is evident from even the most cursory review, the policy underlying them is deeply flawed because, amongst other things, it greatly expands the likely market power of the National Broadband Network Company, the NBN Co, and greatly reduces the level of competition that will prevail in the telecommunications sector. The third point I make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that it is not just of interest to telecommunications policy wonks, if I could perhaps describe myself in that way, and a number of others in this place and the other place. It is not just that small community of persons whose interests are affected by the work the Parliament is doing today. The telecommunications sector is enormous. It is of great economic and social importance. And yet, the major players in this sector, Telstra, Optus, the members of the Competitive Carriers Coalition, such as AAPT, were unable to have more than 36 hours to consider these amendments before the Senate was in a position to vote on them. That is no way to go about making amendments, comprehensive and extensive amendments to a very detailed legislative scheme. That is no way to treat investors in this multi-billion-dollar industry, to completely sweep away from them any capacity to have the kind of certainty as to the regulatory regime under which their investments will be regulated. So when you have regard, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the nature and extent and importance of the stakeholder interests that are affected by this set of amendments which have been rushed through with very inadequate preparation, very inadequate consideration, it is self-evident, I would put to the House, that we need to take more time rather than accede to this government's request or proposal that we simply rush through on a nod and a wave this complex package of amendments without giving them more detailed consideration. Madam Deputy Speaker, the fourth point I want to highlight is this. Embedded in this package are some very significant and deeply unpleasant provisions. I want to particularly highlight section 151DA, which is a section which provides, amongst other things, that if you breach section 143, the new section 143 of the Telecommunications Act, you are committing a criminal offence and you're exposed to 20,000 penalty units. And in substance, you attract that sanction, you're exposed to that sanction, if you choose to operate a network, a so-called superfast telecommunications network, I think is the defined term, and you fail to offer a layer 2 bitstream service. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is truly a return to the bad old days of economic policy in Australia, the days when attempting to sell eggs or milk or any other commodity except under the watchful eye of the relevant state government marketing board exposed you to being followed by inspectors, exposed you to prosecution, involved an extraordinary squandering of state resources dedicated to suppressing energy and innovation and creativity and competition. But that is what we have got back to in this country, in the telecommunications sector, by reason of this legislative scheme which has been seriously embellished by the amendments passed by the Senate on Friday, the amendments which it now falls to the House to consider the merits of. Because included within that set of amendments, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I highlight, is this deeply unsavoury provision, section 151DA, which allows for the imposition of a penalty of up to 20,000 penalty units should you have the temerity to want to deliver a high-speed broadband service in competition with the national broadband network. And doesn't that highlight how fundamentally misconceived this entire legislative scheme is? What has gone wrong in this country when we are imposing penalties upon people, upon companies, upon economic units that want to compete, that want to invest, to deliver services in competition with the government's own national broadband network company? This is a dark day for economic policy in Australia, Madam Deputy Speaker. So on this side of the House, we firmly reject the notion that we should just wave through this package of amendments. It deserves detailed scrutiny.
The question is the amendments be considered immediately. Call the Leader of the House.
I seek leave to speak without closing the debate.
Is any objections leave being granted? It's very magnanimous. Leave is granted. The Minister has the call.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. I seek to make a contribution to this debate on behalf of the government as the mover of the motion, because when I moved this motion, it was anticipated, of course, that it would be supported without debate. That's the way that Labor in opposition operated over 12 years of opposition. That's the way that this place has operated. What we have here, after 12 years of failing to make advances on high-speed broadband and 12 years of inadequate policy and failure on behalf of those opposite, is an extraordinary attempt to delay even the debate about the amendments that are being carried by the Senate. Now, the Senate dealt with these issues over Thursday night and over Friday, and late Friday night carried the bills before the House with amendments. That is the appropriate way that we operate. And indeed, there was some discussion last Thursday about the scheduling of this sitting on Monday morning at 10 a.m. to provide some certainty for members to be able to make appropriate arrangements given commitments that they had in their electorates on Friday. Had we not done that, had we actually done what used to occur of sitting all night here, we would have been sitting here until Saturday, because we couldn't have received these amendments back until Saturday morning from the Senate. So the correct decision, re the management of this House was made. And the correct decision is also for us to consider this legislation here today. We know that under the former government, Australia fell behind the rest of the world on broadband. We were ranked 50th for broadband speeds. Not one Australian city, not one, makes the top 100 in the world for broadband speeds. Many in our region are rolling out fibre broadband networks or have already done so. Japan, Singapore and New Zealand come to mind. And yet the Shadow Minister opposite has said the NBN is an answer to a problem that has not even been identified. That's what the member for Wentworth thinks. What we saw during their period of office was 20 failed broadband plans. At each step, an attempt to delay action. We know the member for Wentworth was appointed by the Leader of the Opposition to demolish the NBN, because the Leader of the Opposition told us. Those opposite said, wait for the ACCC advice. Done. Then they said, wait for the implementation study. Done. And then they said, wait for the response to the implementation study. Then they said, wait for the Senate Committee on NBN. 5 times while 5 separate reports were done. Then they said, wait for a 7-month Productivity Commission inquiry, which they wouldn't even promise that they would listen to. Indeed, they had the then at the time, Senator Joyce, the Shadow Infrastructure Minister, said about Productivity Commission reports, to quote him, I use them when I run out of toilet paper. That's the standard of the debate from those opposite. Then, of course, they wanted a committee of politicians, not the experts, in charge of the NBN rollout. Now, while the coalition calls for delay in the national broadband network, NBN services are up and running in Tasmania, and we've rolled out more than half of the regional fibre optic links. Now, the debate today is extraordinary. They actually can't even get to the substance of the amendments that they want to move. They're having a debate over whether we have a debate. This is, you know, some sort of syndrome which has been captured by the opposition since their defeat on August 21 of last year. This ability to oppose absolutely everything, whether it be of substance, such as the National Broadband Network itself, or whether it be procedures. And people such as in regional Australia, such as the member for Hinkler in this chamber, knows that the broadband services are not up to scratch in regional Australia. They know that that's the case. We know that, that there are pockets, including my electorate, that will always be advantaged in terms of delivery of infrastructure such as broadband in comparison with outer suburbs such as Western Sydney, areas such as the Central Coast, areas of regional Queensland. And it is, quite frankly, extraordinary that this is the case. Now, we had the Leader of the Opposition come in here and, you know, very predictably movie suspension of standing orders, not this time so that it could be on before play school at 3:05, but this time as the first motion of business, predictably. Now, have a look, though. He wants to draw analogies with state politics. Have a look at what state politicians are saying. Now, the Brisbane Lord Mayor, who's, whilst not being a member of Parliament, is, I'm not sure what he is. They've outsourced the leadership of the LNP.
He's the regal.
Had this to say on the 24th of March. I am not opposed to the NBN. However, its rollout across Queensland should be occurring at a faster rate. That's what Campbell Newman had to say. So we're not doing it fast enough. Well, I say to Campbell Newman, in the unlikely event that he's listening to this broadcast, that he should get on the phone. Get on the phone to the nongs who represent the LNP opposite and tell them to get out of the way. Get out of the way and get on with the debate. You know, and this is that's consistent with the other statements that are made by their state leaders. I mean, Will Hodgman, the Tasmanian Liberal leader, said, "I will continue to argue that, in my view, the NBN rollout is a positive thing for this state," on the 28th of July 2010. The Victorian Minister for Employment, Industrial Relations, Manufacturing, Export and Trade said recently on the outcome that 2 Victorian companies have been awarded contracts to assist in building the NBN, said this in a media release. This is a fantastic outcome for Victoria, with potentially $1.3 billion of NBN Co's $1.6 billion of investment coming to our state over the next 5 years. We are committed to working closely with local industry on our promise to ensure there are future opportunities for Victorian companies with the National Broadband Project. Now, this bloke, Minister Dalla Riva, he wasn't caught up at some doorstop with a trick question. This is a media release from him, a media release put out on the 18th of January. Just 2 months ago. Indeed, in the recent campaign conducted on Saturday, Tim Owen, the Liberal candidate for the state seat of Newcastle, told a forum during the campaign on the 9th of March that he supported the early rollout of the NBN to Newcastle, saying that the sooner it was rolled out to Newcastle, the better. I mean, the hypocrisy of those opposite is just unbelievable. And, you know, they talk about not being ready. I mean, they had from last Thursday to this morning to prepare their surprise suspension of standing orders motion, and they couldn't even get it in order. Some of it had to be ruled out of order because they couldn't even get it right, because they just cut and pasted, one would assume, a press release with question marks all over it as part of their motion. I mean, an extraordinary performance. Well, if they'd actually bothered to listen over the weekend to what people had to say about the changes that have been made to the legislation by the Senate, this is what the chief negotiator from Optus, Mr Maha Krishna Pillai, had to say on Inside Business on ABC TV yesterday. This is what he had to say. It is a fundamentally important reform for this economy. That's what he had to say. And he was asked by Alan Kohler, so are you satisfied now with what you've got? And this is what he had to say. He went on to say, do you think you're going to be able to use the NBN to improve Optus's position? And this is what he had to say, quote, "We have said for the last few years that this is all about levelling the playing field, and we think this will give us and others the first-time opportunity to really start to offer those sorts of services across a wholesale-only network run by an organisation that doesn't have an incentive to prefer itself, or an incentive to, if you like, have monopoly profits within its organisation." That's a first. A very important statement, because those opposite took a public monopoly, made it into a private monopoly, and called it reform. Wondered why they had to have 20 separate plans. Simply couldn't get it right. And the fact is, an email from Matt Healy, the chairman of the Competitive Carriers Coalition, had this to say at the end of last week. "It is our view that the amendments to the NBN bills address our issues of concern that had been raised." That's what he had to say. He went on to say, understand that these are needed to support the NBN business case and the notion of regulated monopoly. Went on to say, it is our view that the subsequent amendments ought to be supported. So what we have here is a piece of legislation subject to scrutiny, amended in the Senate, improved as a result of the amendments that have been carried, and those opposite are so underconfident about their ability to raise any issues of substance towards these amendments that we're frankly wasting the House's time with a long debate about whether we have a debate or not. Now, we know that we will be having a debate today. Those opposite know it, we know it. The fact that people have been stumped up to continue to speak for 15 minutes each on this debate in order to drag out the end result will not change the end result. What it will do is expose those opposite as blockers, as wreckers, as prevaricators. It will not change the outcome because the majority of this House supports the national broadband network. A majority of this House want to move forward. Those opposite are, on the one hand, I think they probably think, oh, we're stopping the government. But at the end of the day, these delays that they keep calling for aren't stopping the government. They're stopping the result and impact and benefit to consumers that the national broadband network will bring. That is the end result of this negativity. But negativity, I thought I'd seen the lot. I've seen them oppose the national health reform process. We've seen them oppose the economic stimulus package that saved Australia from the recession that the rest of the world had to endure. We've seen them oppose the levy, which was put on temporarily in order to reconstruct Queensland and other parts of Australia affected by the natural disasters. We've seen them oppose national infrastructure spending in a range of areas. We've seen them oppose action on the national broadband network, but now they're actually reduced to trying to oppose through procedural means even the parliament debating these issues. The opposition should get on with this debate of substance. If they have any amendments to move them by all means. Let them be considered by the House, but we on this side of the House are determined to pursue the benefits to consumers that will result from the national broadband network.
The question is the amendment to be considered immediately. I call the member for Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I speak in support of proper discussion and proper debate on this issue. Once again, we see the Minister and the Government trying to rush through legislation on NBN Co. From day one, we said that they hadn't got it right, and 22 pages of amendments in the Senate showed that to be true. Madam Deputy Speaker, no one disputes the need for broadband and for high-speed broadband, but as we said from day one, not at any cost to the ratepayers. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this is no more. Well, look, the Minister interjects and says, you're in Parliament now. Well, indeed, look at the waste of money today of returning everyone.
You want us to come back?
We want a proper debate. You just want us to be here for 2 hours. And you want to rush it through because it's a shambles, because your legislation is incompetent, because it's a shambles, because you haven't got the model correct in the first place. Now, the Minister quoted Campbell Newman as wanting broadband delivered sooner than later. What Campbell Newman said is he wanted fast-speed broadband, but not with the NBN Co model. In fact, if the Minister had bothered responding to correspondence from Brisbane City Council over a year ago, he might have had some assistance with getting the model and subsequently the legislation correct. But of course they chose to ignore those approaches at the time. Madam Deputy Speaker, I find it appalling that the Minister should suggest that because the Senate has dealt with the issues, that we should support this without debate. These are very important amendments. the minister quite clearly said that we should just ignore it. We will be putting amendments forward, and there are plenty of them.
Order.
Madam Deputy Speaker,
the member will resist responding to interjections.
Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The member for Ryan has the call.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as we've seen today, this is yet again a waste of time and money by the government. This particular project is going to be the largest capital infrastructure for our country. It has gone from $4.7 billion to $47 billion and is growing. As we know, already the initial rollout has expanded in time, and it's also expanded in cost. And yet the government, I notice, and the minister hasn't bothered tabling the cost to date of what the initial rollout is, because once again it's over budget. And once again these amendments will cause no scrutiny by the government or by anyone else. You look through some of the amendments and they suggest that even the APPROPRIATIon should have no power when it comes to scrutinising the NBN co. This is because, of course, it is a monopoly and they don't want to be caught out once again with an old-fashioned, outdated model that we saw previously. Whilst broadband is by far the technology for the future, the NBN co model is outdated on last century's corporations and last century operations. We need an open access system, Madam Deputy Speaker. We don't need another monopoly controlled by the government. We've seen where that comes to. The minister claims that there were 5 separate reports done, all as a result of coalition requests. Well, my memory, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the most important request that we put on, which was critical for the people and taxpayers of Australia, was for a cost-benefit analysis. And yet that wasn't done and hasn't been scrutinised because, once again, it won't stack up. The minister quoted other countries with faster speed broadband as a reason why Australia was lagging and Australia needed to roll out broadband. And yet, once again, the minister failed to say that those countries didn't fund it all from government money. They didn't spend $47 billion plus on paying for broadband to be rolled out in their countries, as he is committing Australians to. Madam Deputy Speaker, we should not be surprised at this government's incompetence. We only have to look at the Pink Bats project, which of course has cost more to fix it up than was the initial projection of cost to roll it out. And unfortunately, we're going to see more and more of these amendments as the NBN co model staggers and fails as well. We've seen the increase in cost, yet at the same time we've seen a reduction of who it's going to be rolled out to. 2 million people less. And yet if you look at the people who it should benefit, the people in the rural regional areas, and I quote from the Regional Telecommunications Independent Review Committee Chairman, Dr Bill Glasson, who was hoping for some benefits from the NBN co, and yet on the 28th of March he said the amendments were immoral and unjustified. And that's from someone who was actually looking forward to potential benefits, who can now see what a disaster we're getting ourselves into. Madam Deputy Speaker, the bottom line is that this government cannot manage their legislation, they cannot manage what they're delivering, and this example of more than 22 pages of amendments is another example of their incompetence. We can have absolutely no confidence that they'll be able to roll out NBN because, as we've seen already, it is already behind schedule. It's past 2030. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd suggest by the time they get it right, probably the technology will be obsolete and at great cost to the ratepayers. So we cannot encourage their continued incompetence, and we need to properly discuss this in greater detail where everyone can have some input to their flawed legislation.
The question is that the amendments be considered immediately. I call the member for Hasluck.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to oppose the telecommunications legislation amendment, National Broadband Networks Measures Access Arrangements Bill for 2011. And I want to commence by citing 2 sections out of the House of Representatives practice. Thus, the House of Representatives is the people's house, and the inheritance of responsible government through cabinet system is the most significant characteristic attached to it. The Ministry is responsible for making and defending government decisions and legislative proposals. There are a few important decisions made by Parliament which are not first considered by Government. However, the Government proposals are subject to parliamentary scrutiny, which is essential in the concept of responsible government. The efficiency and effectiveness of a parliamentary democracy is in some measure dependent upon the effectiveness of an opposition. The more effective the opposition, the more responsible and thorough the government must become in its decision-making processes. And in respect to this legislation, and in particular the amendments, there is a need to consider the amendments within a proper time frame, that where the understanding of members, and I'm talking about all members in this House, is paramount in the decisions that we make. The proposed amendments are not considered from a risk-adverse process that should occur to enable all members to have an understanding of the concepts and constructs of the flow-on effects of each of these amendments. The complexity of the legislation makes it interesting in the way in which you read the proposed bills and how the interrelatedness of the amendments sometimes are confusing. What I would prefer is that we debate these within a proper time frame, allow for an understanding to occur, and for the debate to allow us to consider the amendments in the context of the current legislation, but the flow-on effect for all of our constituents. Because ultimately it is the taxpayer who pays and foots the bill for the NBN. The 50 billion is a sizable sum of money that is not and the process of the management of that money does not fall within the accountability of this parliament. It is exempt from it. On that basis, there is a dereliction of responsibility by members of this House if we do not consider each of those amendments in the level of detail required to make an informed decision. We're not blocking it. We're quite keen to continue having the discussions, but the amendments cannot be placed on a table and then expected that the decisions we make without the implications and understanding of legislation is not consistent with the outcome that is sought. So we're not blocking. It is a matter of having some of the debate that we need to have around some of the... No, Minister. What I like about the Leader of the Parliamentary House is that I love the interjections that you make when challenges become... But it's good, I'm glad that you do debate, because that's the important part of this parliament, is to debate. And you're leading to the notion that we do need to have the debates around each of the amendments in respect to the bill in its totality. And I'm sure that the parliamentary leader has a really good understanding of the interrelatedness of each amendment against the legislation, because then I would have some degree of confidence in what he is proposing. However, the majority of members do not. And I think that the debate has to go to the issue of what we represent for the constituents that we all take care of. Because our decisions extract from their pockets. And I'm pleased to see that the Leader of the House is quite happy to extract from the pockets of taxpayers and to exclude the NBN from parliamentary scrutiny. But let me also say the complex business arrangements that are required to support the legislation and the amendments need to be considered and discussed. And certainly those elements that we need to debate that are of risk have to be considered. Members of this House need to carefully examine and consider the implications of each amendment as it is applied in the context of the total legislation. And to receive them late Friday doesn't allow for that type of scrutiny, particularly in the processes that we have within this House. And I would expect that the bringing us back to debate these... It doesn't matter whether I'm new Leader of the House. It's good that I am new, because at least I get the chance to read the parliamentary procedures, to watch your behaviour, to learn from you, but also to be responsive in terms of the debates that we must have in this House. I also want to say that the efficacy in respect to each of the amendments has to be applied, because this is a far-reaching piece of reform, or significant reform. Too often, the creation of structures, particularly monopolies, can be unchallenged by ordinary Australians who experience difficulties. They can be unchallenged by businesses who have difficulty with a monopoly because they really have nowhere to go. And for it to be exempted from the FOI also makes it challenging in terms of the decision that it makes as a corporate body. Because in that context, it then leaves a high degree of risk in the way in which taxpayers' funding is used. We're not opposed to an effective broadband, but the model of the broadband needs to encompass not just fibre optic cabling, but the best modelling that will deliver to all Australians at all points across this nation, regardless of where people live and choose to live, to manage businesses and to enjoy the expanse of this country. I do have a concern that remote and some regional areas of Australia will not have access to the broadband in which it is purported to be provided. The late amendments are a concern because the House hasn't had the opportunity of looking at the level of detail. And on that basis, it is important that we consider the context in which we debate each of these amendments, including the opposition's amendment, that will go to the way in which this legislation is much more effective and efficient. The Senate spent a whole day discussing each of the amendments. We have been brought today to look at these at a last-minute arrangement. I would criticise... No, that's fine, Leader of the House. I don't have a problem with that.
Order.
I apologise, Madam Deputy Chair, for entering into debate with the Leader of the House, but he's got a very effective voice that is very soothing.
And the member will ignore the interjections.
No, they're very soothing, and I am captured by the words that he utters because I find it difficult to ignore them. The faster broadband is wanted by Australians, and we acknowledge that. But what we also acknowledge is there is a better way of doing it. And certainly these amendments need to be delayed so that we can look at the implications. If it wasn't taxpayers' money and it was the money from another source, then I'd have no difficulty in supporting amendments that have implications for expenditure.
Order.
No, look,
Order.
no, I really do love the sound of Minister Albanese's voice. No, I'm not.
Just because no one would talk to you on Saturday.
Order. The member for Hasluck has the call.
Actually, Leader of the House, I don't always take the full time required. I'll just make the points that are necessary.
Great contribution.
These amendments need to be delayed to allow the type of debate that is required and the rigour that is important. The risk management processes have to be examined because there are elements that are important in this construct. And let me say, I would suggest that the proposed amendments lay on the table to allow considered examination of each, and it allows informed debate or both. It's interesting that the Leader of the House talked about these as being stumped up, that it's not sloppy government, and that it is a delaying factor by the opposition. But our concern, and particularly mine, is that we do the right thing by Australians, that we ensure that the expenditure that we are committing to in these amendments and in this legislation doesn't compound to blow out beyond the 50 million that is referred to. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, with those points and with my enjoyable interaction with the Parliamentary Leader of the House, I conclude my comment and oppose the tabling of the amendments.
The question is that the amendments be considered immediately, and I call the honourable member for Dunkley. Oh, I beg your pardon. I call the honourable member for Hinkler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I too would like to speak to this procedural motion. And my good friend, the Leader of Government Business, the Leader of the House, my good friend, I have a very warm and affectionate interaction with him. More of it, please. more of it. However, I'd just like to explain something to him, as good friends should. I'd like to explain some things to him as good friends should.
Order.
And the thing I'd like to express to him, he taunted us earlier in this debate when he intervened without closing the debate, and I thank him for that. He taunted us to say, why do we endlessly debate procedural motions? Isn't that the case, Leader of the House? You taunted us. And I'll tell you why we do it. We do it because since this government came to power about 3.5 years ago, you have refused to take your fair share of censure motions. The one thing you could always say about the coalition under John Howard, it never ducked a good debate. It was very seldom that John Howard ducked a censure motion because he was confident enough of his government to debate it and beat it. Not just beat it on the numbers, but beat it comprehensively on the argument. So I'd like to ask, rhetorically of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Leader of Government Business, because he's the guy who makes these decisions, essentially, how many times have you accepted a fair dinkum censure motion debate? Very few. So what has happened? What has happened, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we now debate for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, with a 10-minute response from the government, the motion to suspend standing orders. And over time, and in some respects regrettably, it has become the de facto censure motion. Is that not the case? That we have to debate that to the nth degree, as it is the only forum we have to censure the government. Now, this morning, the Leader of Government Business would understand that we have debated some of the substantial or substantive aspects of this NBN bill, not because we want to be bloody-minded in holding up the debate, but because there is an uncertainty of the extent to which the government will allow us to debate it fully. As other speakers have said, it's bad enough to drag back 140 out of 150 members from all parts of Australia to debate this thing when it has been so badly rushed and so badly structured in the Senate. I mean, to think that the Senate had to debate this into Thursday night, then all day Friday, to bring it before us today on Monday, and that at times during those debates the government had to filibuster to keep the debate alive so it could make more amendments, just gives a picture of how incompetent the legislation is. And it should not be surprising to the government that we would want to debate it more fully. Just looking at some of the aspects of this, and the member for Bradfield described these rather succinctly in his presentation today. The fact that these amendments create an even greater monopoly should be a concern to all members. If you go back in telecommunications in Australia to the old Postmaster General's Department, you can understand why, with a country as extensive as Australia was at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, you can well understand how the government had to become involved in rolling out telecommunications. as we came into the 60s, 70s and 80s, and a more enlightened view of competition was adopted by all political parties, it became obvious that our telecommunications were quite antiquated in their approach. You can remember we had the Kennedy inquiry that separated the PMG into two entities, into Australia Post and into Telecom. Good move. Then we saw Telecom take the primary voice role, the voice and data role. One of the great disappointments in that development of telecommunications was that the then Minister in the early 90s, Kim Beazley, in the 91-92 period, which was crucial for this, he squibbed it. He squibbed it. He should have gone a step further and separated Telecom, the then Telecom, into a wholesale and retail entity. Had he done that, I imagine a half or three-quarters of the debate we have had to have in this parliament over the last 2 decades may never have had to occur. May never have had to occur. So where do we find ourselves now with the NBN? Well, the government knows the opposition's ambivalence to the NBN, and I have quite publicly stated my ambivalence to it. It seems to me extraordinary in this day and age that we would want to spend up to $43 billion, and some predict that before it's finished we'll be looking at $50 billion if the current scheme goes ahead in its entirety. $50 billion. A lot of money, isn't it? If you look at what's happened around the world, the per capita subsidy for bringing broadband into Australia is far in excess of any nation on earth. Many times, New Zealand, France, the United States, Canada, many, many times more. So we've embarked on this high subsidy government plan to introduce the NBN. I think honourable members will be concerned at some of the matters that are proposed in these amendments, and I won't go over them in great detail because many of them have already been canvassed. But it troubles me to think that in Tasmania, in towns where one of our committees of the parliament has already visited, we have only 15% uptake. It troubles me to think that we've embarked on this great adventure of very high spending, and yet last week we rushed through the Senate this whole range of amendments. And I think it is proper, and I speak now to the procedural motion, I think it is proper that we give this thing quite adequate consideration. As the member for Bradfield said, one of the provisions will be to restrict monopolies. Will be to restrict other companies to the monopolistic control of NBN. That's a bit concerning when you think about it, because isn't that a retrograde step? Isn't that returning us to the old telecom PMG sort of attitude? So you've got that aspect of it that needs consideration. The fact that the ACCC can't scrutinise it. Now, there's an extraordinary aspect. Why would you not have an entity of this nature that is going to be in the business of providing, or so we're told, of providing a platform for vibrant competition, and yet the organisation itself, the core organisation that's going to be at the heart of this, will itself not be subject to the rigours of the APPROPRIATIon. I just find that quite amazing. So we're going to have this return to the past. We're going to enhance the monopolistic control of the NBN according to this legislation. We're not going to allow it to be subjected to the ACCC. And the killer, as the Shadow Minister has said in his address this morning, the killer of all killers is a backdoor way by which the NBN can sell to almost anyone other than householders and small business, can engage directly with them, in other words, create within itself a de facto retail arm. Now that is even more worrying. I think if you add, that's just a few of the amendments, but I think if you take that business, if you take any of them seriously, then I think we've come to a point, Madam Deputy Speaker, where this matter ideally should be deferred to for at least several days for proper scrutiny. But today we should make sure that the intimate detail of the things that have come across from the Senate are well and truly examined. As many have said, this is the greatest single infrastructure spend in Australia's history. It deserves better than what it's getting.
The question is that the amendments be considered immediately. I call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The one thing we can be certain about from this government is with anything to do with the NBN, we're guaranteed there'll be surprises. This has been one of the most shambolic processes of public policy development and then policy implementation I think any of us in this chamber has seen. And the discussion and the debate we're having now is whether we should again react as a parliament to the latest set of surprises. Surprises that emerged late last week in relation to the discussion, the negotiations and the debate in the Senate. These latest surprises follow a long list of surprises, and they're also represent another example of how the government just can't manage this process at all. When I was the Shadow Minister, we had this problem then. They were interesting days, and thank you for the vote of confidence, Parliamentary Secretary, but they were interesting days in that every time a piece of legislation relating to the NBN was presented, it was up to the opposition, the coalition, to try and shepherd it through the Parliament, so inept and incompetent was the Minister. I remembered that with the show and tell legislation, where after the government the Labor Party went to the 2007 election, not with a policy, but with a few thought bubbles written in crayon on the back of an envelope, which they were running around as a considered plan when really it was badge engineering of Telstra's own network upgrade strategy. They then thought, well, we'd better check how this might actually work. And they thought, well, as a parliament, let's force telecommunications providers to provide really fundamental information about their network and their services so that there was some way of working out how the government could inject itself into this broadband space. Now, that was important because it recognised one simple fact that the government continues to fail to recognise today, and that is there is no such thing as an NBN. There are networks of networks that combine together to provide the broadband functionality that's available for Australian consumers. And there are many other stakeholders that have a great interest in what happens in this place because they've got assets, they've got skin in the game. And I use the analogy of breakfast. Some of you may have had bacon and eggs for breakfast, and I use this analogy. The chicken might have been involved, but by golly, the pig was committed, wasn't it? By golly, the pig was committed. Now, in this space, there are many telecommunications companies that are the equivalent of the bacon, that have put their own resources and their own commitment and their own investments into the industry. And even way back then, in the early months of 2008, there was still a complete confusion about the government's policy. Senator Conroy, the minister, sought to extract some insights from those that were active in the industry and then proposed this show and tell legislation, and then failed to provide for the proper process and proper time for it to be passed through the parliament. So the opposition had to facilitate that. Senator Conroy and the Labor government had failed to consult with just about everybody. There was nobody who'd been spoken to about some of these provisions, and again, it was up to the coalition to provide some constructive amendments to enable information to be provided with appropriate security and scrutiny in terms of how that material would be used. And this is just one example, but it happened again in 2009. Again, another requirement on the opposition, the coalition parties, to facilitate the government's work. And despite all of this history, we're back here again today with exactly the same circumstances. The single largest infrastructure build the Commonwealth of Australia has been involved with, and we are still here expected to deal with it on the run. Expected to deal with it on the run. We've gone from a crayon notes on the back of an envelope, a plan that never got out of the starting blocks, that was redefined and re-examined, to an NBN concept that sees the government displace every other business in the sector potentially displace every other business in the sector. And here we are today debating what we can do to sort of mitigate against the harm and the real life concerns and commercial concerns that arise from the government's approach. So it's interesting for the manager of government business. He comes in here and condemns the previous government for having a number of different plans in relation to broadband. What he fails to accept and fails to share is the reason there were a number of different plans, all of which were implemented, a word that's unfamiliar to the Labor Party when it comes to broadband. Those various plans actually implemented, some of which still run today in terms of broadband guarantee and the like, were actually taking account of changing circumstances in the technology and in terms of customer expectation. So what's held up as a sin by the government against the coalition was actually a virtue. Implementation of successive strategies recognising higher expectations, technological improvements, and a nation keen to keep pace with those. But the government hasn't had to worry about that, because while it's been fumbling over the NBN, it's frozen investment in so many parts of the telecommunication industries. I would say the Labor government's approach to broadband is a net negative at the moment. I think their contribution has actually taken the sector far back from where it would otherwise have been had the private sector had the confidence to invest. And so we're here again today after extended sitting hours with a new set of proposals. And I was just discussing with the Shadow Minister, is this 6th or 7th version of the NBN? If we're going to count numbers of plans, how many times has the government had a go at this, trying to get it right? And again, here is yet another effort. Here is yet another effort that reflects the fact that the public policy motives that might guide government behaviour in this place have been put to one side while there's this seemingly single-minded ambition to build something that can have an NBN sticker stuck on it and that the government can claim as an achievement. And one of the amendments we're discussing today is how utterly changed the government's position is on what was supposed to be a so-called wholesale-only model for the NBN. What a remarkable change. And I say it's remarkable for a couple of reasons. When you go all the way back to 2008, there was a Canadian consortium. Yeah, I think they were called Axia, if my memory serves me correctly. And you know, they were actually happy to build a broadband backbone network with many, many points of interconnect with no taxpayer money. They didn't want any taxpayer money. They were happy to proceed with the rollout of additional fibre investment and infrastructure across Australia, not on the basis of taxpayer money. You know what their interest was? Their interest was being guaranteed a customer base. They actually said if we could be certain we'd get the government's own telecommunications business, that could finance the investment itself. So they were saying, give us some guaranteed business, and that will be enough to build up the business case for a Canadian-based company to do what they've done in British Columbia, to do what they've done in France, and actually not require taxpayers' money.
What a revelation.
That was their proposition. This was back in the RFP days, when it wasn't a request for proposal, it was the government pleading for a request for a policy. They had no idea how to actually implement an NBN. And here we had a Canadian consortium happy to do what is now being discussed and now being facilitated by these amendments, where the wholesale carrier-only assurance is being displaced by a new arrangement where carriers can shape themselves into or businesses can shape themselves into some kind of telco provider and then buy services from the NBN and effectively undermine this wholesale-only model. So they're now flopping around with an idea to go back to a very proposition. Had they thought this through, 4 years ago, there'd probably be $50 billion less of taxpayer money going into this venture. But the problem the government had when it started on this ambition was all they had was a soundbite and no sound public policy framework. And we flip and flop around each time this legislative process comes back to the Parliament as they try and fix and manoeuvre and mend and remedy and renovate little bits and pieces as it evolves throughout the process. So today we're faced with another lot of these on-the-run remedies and on-the-run proposals. I touched on this so-called wholesale-only model of the NBN and make it clear to the Australian public and to this Parliament there was an investor prepared to roll out an enhanced high-speed broadband infrastructure without any public money had this opportunity that's now being afforded to NBN Co been more generally available when the government was looking for a way to implement its soundbites. 23 pages of changes to the Telecommunications Access Bill and 5 more sets of pages of complex changes to the NBN Companies Bill are what we're being asked to deal with today, and we're being told take it in good faith. It's all good stuff. Well, the telecommunications industry aren't convinced of that. The opposition is always looking for some continuity and clarity from the government as it fumbles its way through. But for the consumers out there, you wonder where they're going to be left after this latest lot of on-the-run changes the government's trying to force through this Parliament. Do you know, if you or I were a telecommunications provider and we wanted to change our fees to sell to another participant in the industry, we'd have to advertise that. We'd have to go out under the competition laws of this country and say, here's what we're planning to do. And then anybody who's affected by it gets the opportunity to have a go at what our intentions are. And then the regulator, the APPROPRIATIon, would adjudicate and say, you know, that's reasonable, or hang on, one of these other stakeholders has a point, you should make some changes here. That relates today to even a proposal to vary a cost of a fairly modest proportion. And that's seen as a safeguard. But under this bill, the ACCC is not even entitled to get anywhere near some fundamental issues relating to how NBN is going to operate. They're not enabling an intervention on interconnect points. And we remember where this came from. The original proposal from NBN Co was to have 14 only 14 points of interconnect. So if retailers wanted to plug in their own distribution network for that last mile, or more broadly invest in their own infrastructure to complement or to work with what's available, they only had 14 points on this vast continent on where to connect. Now the ACCC, to its credit, actually said there should be at least 121 points of interconnect, so that there is some scope for other parties to get involved in further investment nearer to the consumer, nearer to the retail end of this industry. Well, the ACCC, as useful as that contribution was then, now won't have that opportunity to make that contribution under these amendments. There's also an issue about the ACCC's role in bundling services, and we've seen time and time again in the telecommunications industry how bundled services in some appropriate and some inappropriate ways have actually had an enormous impact in the competitive structure of telecommunications in this country. And even the way in which cross-subsidisation works and the way in which the ACCC can look at that as some manipulation of the market, the ACCC's power will be hugely curtailed in that space as well. These are just some of the changes that are being asked of this parliament today to rush through, and this is why we need a proper opportunity to examine them. Had we started this journey where the bill now proposes we go, this could have been done without a dime of taxpayers' money. It could have been done without a dime of taxpayers' money. There are international models operating today with Canadian-based consortiums willing to invest in Australia when this journey started some years ago, who all they were looking for was some certainty that they'd get government telecommunications business and the potential for other certainty in the terms of the revenue that they could rely upon, and they were prepared to make that investment with many, many interconnect points across this vast continent. Instead, we're here, $50 billion of taxpayer exposure on the table to now change the model to be the very model that was said not to be suitable some years ago. Well, now it's okay today. And this is what happens when you don't have a sound public policy framework. I say to those Australians in outer metropolitan, rural and regional areas, it didn't have to be like this. The former government put $960 million of funding on the table. Through the OPEL plan, those areas where there was underinvestment and where it was uneconomic for the private sector to invest, and where as a result there was a lag in the availability of broadband and the performance of that service, there was a remedy available, a remedy that could have delivered benefits. Instead, there'll be a child that was born back then that could have had their whole education supported by improved broadband, facilitated by the Coalition's Opal investment. Every year they could have benefited that right throughout their education. Now, under this shambolic process the government's overseen, that child will miss that benefit.